very warm welcome to this Pax Christi Forum on a Sustainable Peace, or a Militarized Asia-Pacific. And a warm welcome to everyone, and especially those who are joining us from outside Australia, which includes the United States, Brussels, Timor-Leste, I think the Philippines, and many from interstate. Sorry? And New Zealand. Belgium, yes.
Japan.
Japan, yeah.
New Zealand and New Zealand.
New Zealand.
Yeah. Got out.
So we're truly international. Our subject is militarism, peace or militarism, which is something which we in Pax Christi Victoria have been focused on for some time, are trying to see how we can respond to. And of course, there's all the build-up around the South China Sea, it's the military situation in Myanmar, tension between India and China, and much more. And concern to us in Australia as we tie ourselves to alliance with the United States is the fact that our government sees developing the arms industry as one way to economic success. So we have a panel of 2 speakers and then 4 responses. After that, I'm going to try and put you into small groups. And then we'll come back and have some discussion. At the end, which looks about 3:45 now, we'll move to the annual general meeting of Pax Christi Victoria, and you're all welcome to stay for that, but you're also, if you wish to say goodbye, you're welcome to do that as well. Our initial speaker is Father Claude Mostovic. Claude is the president of Pax Christi Australia, been our leader for many years. He's a lot of international experience. He's a member of the Missionaries of the Sacred Heart congregation. He's a clinical psychologist with experience of working in Indigenous communities, and his congregation is promoter of justice and peace in Australia. And he's involved with various justice and peace focused groups, including the Intercongregational Voice on Climate Change that serves Pacific Island nations, and his research and publications officer at the Edmund Rice Centre in Sydney. And he's going to talk to us about the Pax Christi Nonviolence Initiative. So, Claude, it's all yours.
Thank you, Harry, and good afternoon to everybody, and or good morning to those who are in Europe. But I just want to acknowledge that I'm on Gadigal land here in Sydney, and pay my respects to the First Nations people of this land, and also the people of the Wiradjuri country from where I was born. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you this afternoon, and thank you for coming. In 2016, April 2016, 85 people from about 35 countries gathered in Rome, auspiced by Pax Christi International and also the dicastery, one of the dicasteries from the Vatican, on non-violence. And many of these people came from places of extreme violence and oppression, places in Latin America, the Philippines. They had experiences of violence in Croatia and so on. And it was a marvelous gathering of people who I would consider to be the experts on non-violence. A few people there objected to some of the issues like just war, we shouldn't get rid of it and all that sort of stuff. But on the whole, these people gathered with their experiences where they had paid the price in so many ways for their stands in those countries. And so, you know, and I consider those people to have been the experts on the issue that we're talking about. Jose Enrique, who was the former Secretary General of Pax Christi International, said we need to go back to the sources of our faith and rediscover the non-violence which is at the heart of the gospel. And the goal of the non-violence resistance to injustice is, as I see it, always to awaken humanity, the humanity in every person. And this conference was convened, as I said, by the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace and Pax Christi International on that topic of non-violence and just peace. And I think the just peace is a very important part of our conversation this afternoon. The conference finished with a document called an appeal to the Catholic Church to recommit to the centrality of gospel non-violence. And though referred to Catholic non-violence initiative, it's not a confessional call, but it's about the centrality of gospel non-violence for all the churches. And it was a call for the churches to move to a just peace based on that gospel non-violence, as I said. In his recent encyclical, Pope Francis, encyclical Fratelli Tutti, lamented how the world has learned a lesson from its many wars and disasters, and was again had learned from these wars and disasters. It was moving towards various forms of integration, but now it was being trapped in a strange contradiction. He said, we believe that we can ensure stability and peace through a false sense of security sustained by a mentality of fear and mistrust. And he concludes by saying that in many parts of the world, there is a need for paths of peace to heal open wounds and come back to that just peace again. It's important that non-violence is cultivated in people's everyday lives, as well as the institutions. And this is what Francis calls the politics of non-violence, a culture that includes personal lives as well as institutions. All these are necessary if we're going to achieve that global peace. When we consider violence and conflict and war, we can't ignore the violence within our institutions and social and cultural structures. As we know, as we see in the treatment of the First Nations people in this country since colonial times, the forced removal of children, the Indigenous overrepresentation in prison and deaths in custody, the conditions of refugees and asylum seekers, as well as LGBTIQ people. So it's a whole range of expressions of violence in our institutions and also in our communities. The appeal that came out of that conference was a call to recognise, as I've already indicated, the centrality of active nonviolence to Jesus' message, in which we have not been consistent, but silent about or justifying violence, injustice, and war, which was a betrayal of the gospel's central message. The church has often not been consistent in its teachings on non-violence, and we know that about just war, about capital punishment, and so many of those other issues. And to live this gospel of non-violence and just peace requires an integration explicitly into all the areas of our lives. The conference that I went to summoned us to walk in the paths of Jesus' non-violence and to turn to just peace. And it reaffirmed three things: the centrality of active non-violence to the life of the church, to prophetically proclaim another way, and to commit to the long-term vocation of healing and reconciling both people and the planet, according to the vision and message of Jesus. The call for a just peace reflects how we relate to ourselves, to each other, to the earth, and to our God. It's not new. If there's no just peace, peace is not possible. It cultivates justice and peace in ourselves, in our relationships, in our social and political structures, and our culture, whilst also resisting injustice and violence. It's necessary to recognise and acknowledge suffering and violence and harm done. It's the healing process. And our task is to find ways to build better and more resilient peace, which indicates a participatory process in right relationships, restoration, reconciliation, and sustainability. We can no longer justify cases where armed force may be legitimised. The key goal is to outlaw war, not to legitimize or to refine the criteria of war by using or teaching just war theory. This is one of the subjects that came up at that conference, where a very small number of people wanted to maintain this tradition or this theory, and to the objections of those others who, as I called, were the experts. The focus is to apply the vast amounts of peacemaking research, civil resistance tactics, and just peace principles with the Church's deep and pervasive theology. Just peace is not merely the absence of violence, but the presence of social, economic, and political conditions that sustain peace and human flourishing and prevent conflicts from turning violent or returning to violence. Laudate Si, the Pope's encyclical from 5 years ago, has become, as I see it, a manifesto for just peace. It's an integral ecology which contributes to an integral just peace. The Pope recognizes that violence done to human communities is often accompanied by, as we know, devastating environmental destruction. And this has been connected with what we hear in terms of the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. And the lack of connection with the environment is a form of violence and contributes to the activity of war. In any peace plan, it's always dialogue, dialogue, and dialogue within society, among states, and with other faiths, to build a people of peace through reconciliation. And peace building is people building. And dialogue is not enhanced by, as what we're hearing in the media so often lately, of vilification and provocative language, or forming pacts against other nations. The just peace approach means that we cannot settle for the end justifies the means approach. This peace approach is not easy or quick either. It includes restorative justice, diplomacy, building community relationships and integral development, to prevent and challenging systems that profit from war, and acknowledging our interconnection with and caring for the environment. In 2005, the United Nations report, The Inequality Predicament, stressed that ignoring inequality in the pursuit of development is perilous. And the Sustainable Development Goal number 16 says we need to promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, to provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. So it recognizes that conflict and fragility have destructive impacts on the journey out of poverty for countries, as essential infrastructure such as hospitals and schools are destroyed, including increased risk of sexual and gender-based violence that force families to seek safety or asylum in other countries. Diplomacy between nation states is critical, and we haven't seen too much of that happening lately, to prevent armed conflict and war, but strengthening the capacity of nation states to prevent and manage violence. Peace building is very much something that's been underfunded, despite the cost effectiveness of investing earlier, investing in preventing disputes from escalating rather than intervening after violence erupts. There's been a progressive decline in foreign aid and development assistance in recent decades from this country. Australia contributes little as part of the global peace-building budget, and given the number of fragile and conflict-affected states in the Asia-Pacific region, we can and should invest more in peace-building. It's in our national interest. Australia is in a powerful position in the Asia-Pacific region, but we need to ask, what kind of neighbour or global citizen will we be? It's not always seen as a good neighbour. In 2007, the Australian Catholic bishops challenged us to consider our role through the lens of globalisation and interdependence, and to base our judgments largely on the question of whether the least among us are doing well. This has implications for our foreign aid, as well as how we respond to people in our own communities. To conclude, investing wisely in other countries across all areas of development is important to building peace, as healthy ecosystems that include improved education, healthcare, and living conditions. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Claude. We'll go straight on to our next speaker, who's Cesar de Mello, and Cesar has organized this forum. So thank you very much, Cesar, for doing that and for drawing such a international community around it. Now, Cesar is truly a man of the world. He's a member of Pax Christi Australia. He's formerly National Director of Christian World Service, which is the Aid and Development Commission of the National Council of Churches in Australia. He's been a director of the Ecumenical Coalition on Tourism in Thailand, which is an agency of the World Council of Churches. He's a consultant in justice and peace, ecology and development concerns in the Third World, and he has extensive development and ecumenical experience within Asia. And he is himself, of course, from India. And he's going to speak on scrutinizing the Quad. So, Cesar, it's all yours.
Thank you, Harry. Can you hear me all?
Muted, so they can't answer. So I presume they can.
Yes.
I think they can, Cesar, so just go ahead.
He's muted himself.
You're muted, Claude.
Yeah, unmute Claude. Oh, Caesar, sorry.
Okay.
Yep, that's better.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. There was a request earlier that people mute themselves. Please do that.
Well, they all have, I think.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Now, Claude spoke in terms of the issues of theology on just war, peace, and all those issues. What I'm going to do is basically look at one thread in this matrix of international affairs called the Quad, and go a bit beneath the surface of Quad and the word itself. Now, as with politics generally, realpolitik governs much of the international relations arena. National economic, political, and cultural interests, interlinking aspirations and loyalties, ideological competition, historical memory and bias, power and domination, intersect and collide. Is this the route to sustainable peace? Transparency is often a casualty of realpolitik, especially during times of conflict and tension. The Quad indeed is a case in point of how much more we are entitled to know. The Quad, a significant tool of Australian foreign and policies, defense policies, Quad meaning quadrilateral dialogue, security dialogue, first began in 2007, initiated with Australia, India, and the US by former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe as an Asian arc of democracy. It was endorsed as a forum for dialogue by former US Vice President Dick Cheney, former Australian Prime Minister John Howard, and former Indian Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh. The four countries were also involved in the joint Malabar exercises, a grouping with linked diplomatic and military dimensions was already then being widely regarded in the context of China who expressed its displeasure via diplomatic protests issued to the Quad members. It was further incensed with the participation of Singapore in Malabar. In 2008, the Quad ceased to function when Australia under Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, Japan under Prime Minister Yasuo Fukuda, and India under Dr. Manmohan Singh withdrew, but Australia-US military cooperation continued, as did the US, Japan, and India joint naval exercises. The hand of the US can be seen in the later revival of Quad. In 2017, on the sidelines of an ASEAN summit in Manila, US President Donald Trump urged a new security strategy for what he called for the democracies of the region, a region he called Indo-Pacific. The change in nomenclature from the generally used Asia-Pacific prompted, for instance, the East Asia Forum of the Australian National University to ask, is the Indo-Pacific a geographic definition or a strategy? If the latter, we need to know what its proponents have in mind. However, the doublespeak is revealing. India's current Prime Minister Narendra Modi said, India does not see the Indo-Pacific as a strategy or as a club of limited members, as a grouping seeking to dominate, as directed against any country. A geographical definition as such, it cannot be. Pious words, they turned out to be. As the border wars have deteriorated and the military parity has collapsed with China, a supporter of Pakistan, the US has now become a most welcome partner to India. Despite its usual wariness with alliances, India values the Quad, inviting Australia to rejoin the Malabar exercises, which it did this year. Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, in his second stint, declared the Quad does not mean necessarily engaging in any military activities, calling the Indo-Pacific a zone of peace and prosperity, a sentiment echoed by successor Prime Minister Suga. Former US Defense Secretary Jim Mattis's position, reinforced by current Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, associated the Quad with the US Trump administration's national security and defense strategies that regard China as a strategic competitor. The US would reinvigorate American investment, work to strengthen the rule of law, increase attention to the maritime space, and deepen alliances. The Australian Foreign Policy White Paper has adopted the idea of an Indo-Pacific as a geographical space without much elaboration. Bilateral agreements, however, that strengthen the Quad, such as, for instance, the secret 10-year Australia-US Defense Cooperation Treaty and the defense alliance with Japan that Prime Minister Scott Morrison is about to sign when he goes to Japan soon, they remain. We should also recall the $270 billion and more Australia has committed to upgrade its military technology and hardware over the next decade. Our neighbors are very wary about Quad. South Korea will not entertain joining Quad Plus. Indonesia, Vietnam, and Singapore are keeping their distance, and so is New Zealand. And in a way, each of these countries have disputes with China. Despite the obfuscation, it is well realized that the elephant in the room is China. Quad insists its concerns are with cybersecurity, COVID, etc. And Indo-Pacific just renames a geographic space, which China does not buy. The reference to the two oceans which lap the shores of the four countries, each in conflict with China, serves to put pressure on China. China sees an Indo-Pacific so conceptualized as a strategy for its encirclement or containment, which the Quad denies. China considers the Quad, with its interchangeable military and diplomatic objectives, as an Asian NATO structured against its rise. It markedly notes Australia's membership of such an alliance, a country it considers as often a proxy of the US. Diplomacy begins with understanding. A deft, nuanced foreign policy requires a serious and credible appreciation of what China believes is its more than century-long age of humiliation at the hands of Western powers, especially Anglo-Saxon powers. China has been impelled by what it considers its historical obligation to recover its standing in the world. Deng Xiaoping's reinstatement in 1978 and his interpretation of Chinese Marxism provided an impetus to China to its present-day economic preeminence. Vexed by policies and actions that come across as reminiscent of its own age of humiliation, it responds in a variety of ways, including militarization, triggering tit-for-tat Quad responses, thereby ensuring serious regional tension. Kowtowing to China and not holding it accountable for its human rights, territorial, and other violations is not what is suggested, but more sophistication in how we deal with a complex power is. To conclude, we have to question whether foreign and defense policies as conducted are the way to go for securing sustainable peace, when the militarist mindset is so pervasive. This is at the core of the Pax Christi's nonviolence initiative, inspired by Pope Francis, he of Laudato Si, our common home, Fratelli Tutti. Can leaderships that place their trust in weaponry, in military deployment experts, and the arms developers and arms merchants, and egged on by segments of the community, media, and the commentariat, without acknowledging that investment in weapons and military preparedness has not made the world safer, without incorporating the soft diplomacy of trust building, good relations, and communication, and without taking on board the serious voices of those advocating non-violent ways of transforming conflict. Who are the dreamers? The peacemakers? Or those who believe that they will achieve true peace by preparing for just one more war? Thank you.
So thank you very much, Caesar. I think both speakers have raised the challenge of militarism, particularly in our region, and exposed its threats and limitations. We're going to have four brief comments now from different members of Pax Christi. First of all, from Rita Camilleri, who's been Secretary and Treasurer of Pax Christi Victoria since it began. She's been a teacher in a multicultural context, and she's been involved in educational and advocacy, nuclear disarmament, multiculturalism, social justice, and for a doctorate, she made a special study of government in Malaysia. So welcome, Rita, and please speak to us now. Rita, you have to unmute. Just a minute.
Thank you, Harry.
Right.
I'm going to be brief, I hope. Australia is preparing for war. There's no immediate threat. We just want to help our once great and powerful nuclear-armed ally. We've committed our submarine fleet to help the US conduct surveillance in the South China Sea. Our current military budget is $38.7 billion and growing, plus another $3 billion, which is counted separately for ASIO and the other security organisations. Our economy, they tell us, needs a bit of help. So what better way than to manufacture and sell arms as one of the top 10 in the world? We welcome scientists to come and research and develop and improve weapons, some of which have been labelled ethical. The question is anyone doing anything about it in Australia? And I'm answering yes, and I'm going to list a few organisations and people that are trying to do something, but I'll prefix that by saying this is not an exhaustive list. I'll quickly go through a few of these people doing great work. MAPW, the Medical Association for the Prevention of War. Their last campaign is, the current one, is helping Australian superannuation funds divest from nuclear weapons companies. MAPW is the founding member of the national group Australian Arms Control Coalition, working for greater transparency and accountability in the arms trade. It produced original research on weapons company incursions into Australian education, which is a real worry. It has taken action on the climate crisis. As we know, war is the greatest polluter, and supports whistleblowers, refugees, asylum seekers, and Indigenous communities resisting nuclear waste dumps, especially in South Australia. It has been vocal and a persistent voice for non-violent resolutions to current conflicts in Yemen, West Papua, and Iran. Another organisation which is much newer than MAPW is IPAN, Independent and Pacific Australia Network. At the moment, IPAN is about to launch an inquiry into the political, economic, social, environmental, and mental health effects of war on the Australian people. The aim of the inquiry is twofold: to facilitate a deep conversation and engagement with the broader Australian community, and also to determine a path forwards for genuinely non-aligned, independent Australian and peaceful Australian foreign policy, and to ensure a more just allocation of Australian government resources, and then to produce a public report with steps to ensure not only a national conversation, but what people really think and can really suggest the way forward. Another group, very new, relatively recent, Campaign to Stop Killer Robots. This is all about totally autonomous weapons with no human control. They work via algorithms, and some of us know a little bit about algorithms. And of course, there are issues of accountability, ethical issues, technological issues, you name it. But many thousands of people in many countries have pledged not to participate in this ban and are working towards a ban. CICD is another organisation, a very old organisation in Australia, in Victoria, and it has a weekly program on radio and a regular newsletter. So that is something that some of the other groups do as well. I'm going to run out of time, so I'll just say there are other groups like APAN, the Australia-Palestine Advocacy Network, PEN, Palestine-Israel Interfaith Network, ANTAR, Australians for Native Title and Reconciliation. The names say it all. I need not elaborate. Now, just a word about success of some organisations. First of all, Safe Ground. Now, they have participated with other organisations, and their hard work culminated in the adoption of the Mine Ban Treaty and the Convention on Cluster Munitions. They are now have taken the next step, which is for adequate compensation for the victims of war, which would include refugees. And last but not least is ICAN, International Campaign for the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons, which I'm sure you know has been the work of hundreds of people in many countries. And on the 21st, I think, of January 2021, the Treaty Against Nuclear Weapons, it will come into law so that any country at all that has anything to do with nuclear weapons will be breaking international law, and that is a great achievement. Finally, Pax Christi. We are a small group, but part of an international peace movement. In many ways, we try to educate the community. We organise fora, we lobby, we set up studies into, for example, Anzac. When at the centenary of Anzac, we argued and urged against legitimisation of war. This gave rise to another group called Australians for Nuclear Disarmament. A much earlier campaign had given birth to People for Nuclear Disarmament during the Cold War in the 80s. These are things that Pax Christi's managed to have a hand in. So to conclude, I feel outreach by individuals or collectively is the key to moving out into the mainstream. We've had a few successes, but a lot more has to be done. And in spite of all the small battles we've won, the mainstream is barely touched. We seem to be doing the same people doing the same thing, different things all the time. And what we desperately need is that all anti-war, all anti-violence groups come together and perhaps form a critical mass from which true peace has a chance to emerge. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rita, for listing all those organizations. We're now moving straight on to our next contributor, who is Sister Patricia Fox. And Sister Pat belongs to the Sisters of Our Lady of Zion. She's been a teacher in the USA, Israel, and Nicaragua. She studied law and practiced legal aid, but in 1990, she went to the Philippines, where she was working with farmers.
Harry, we're losing you.
Sorry?
Speak in the microphone.
Oh, right. Sorry, can you hear me now?
A little bit.
Just a minute.
Harry, we can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
You can?
Yep.
Right. Well, in that case, I was introducing Sister Patricia Fox, who belongs to the Sisters of Our Lady of Zion. She's, in 1990, she went to the Philippines to work with farmers, agricultural workers, fisher folk, and indigenous people. In 2018, you may remember she was in the news that she was deported on President Duterte's orders for her work in human rights. And back in Australia, she's active in Philippine solidarity, human rights issues, and is a member of the Pax Christi Victoria Committee. So, Pat, it's all yours. If you could unmute yourself and off you go. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Harry. I'd just like to start by giving a little bit of the human rights situation in the Philippines, based on a report from the United Nations Human Rights Commissioner, some special rapporteurs and independent group like Amnesty International, just to give a bit of an idea of what's happening there. But you would have heard of the drug war, more than likely. Now, since Duterte in July 2016, officially they have acknowledged 8,663 people have been killed. But what they say is 22,780 have been under investigation. And independent groups say these are not people, these are also people who have been eliminated under this drug war. 63 of these have been children, and there are now 223,000 in jail on this drug war. With the overcrowding of the jails and etc., people would rather go to jail and be killed, even if they haven't done anything. And just a recent incident a few days ago, a 27-year-old, he'd been texting a friend to say he needed money to get away because the police were threatening him. He was found in the gutter with gunshot wounds. Someone took him to the hospital. The doctors managed to revive him. He was in the emergency part. Police came in and looked around, went out. Within 5 minutes, a masked person had come in and got him dead. And he had a sign on him when he was left in the gutter about being a drug pusher. So it's still happening. When some lawyers took one of the cases, because it's very difficult to get evidence and it's very difficult because people are scared, they managed to take a couple of cases to the International Criminal Court. President Duterte immediately withdrew from that court. There are at least 208 human rights defenders, farmers, Indigenous peoples, journalists, and trade unionists, including 30 women and at least 40 legal professionals who have been killed since 2016. And many of the legal people were working on politically sensitive cases or advocating for land and environmental rights, or the rights of people for housing. It's considered one of the most dangerous places for journalists and environmental defenders. There are 609 political prisoners under Duterte. He's revoked the license of a prominent website, Rappler, and also one of the biggest media, TV, radio networks in the country, because they reported on his drug war, basically. And now with the floods there, some of the people are saying that radio network was the only one that reached them, so they don't get any warnings now of floods. It used to be they relied on the radio. That same report also said that the COVID-19 has further accelerated the downward spiral of human rights in the Philippines. Police and military are being used in the COVID rather than a health approach, using violence and lethal force to enforce the quarantine imposed without due consideration of the situation of the poorest and most vulnerable communities. And a lot of the small places don't have running water, and they go out to get water and they have been arrested or they've been beaten up. That's been one of the responses to the COVID. Another thing I'd like to raise is the anti-terrorism law that was passed recently. Experts warn that this will further dilute the human rights safeguards, justifying the arrest of human rights defenders and government critics, authorising lengthy detentions based on warrantless arrest, wiretapping, and other surveillance for extended periods of time. And these are all in that anti-terrorism bill with a very broad definition of terrorism. That's also been warned that it's particularly dangerous because the practice has been for the military to what they call red tag. In barangays or towns, you find posters with the names of people who are environmental defenders, human rights workers, peasant leaders, and underneath accusing them of being supporters of terrorists. And that's one of the crimes under this Terrorism Act. So what people are scared of it, there's going to be a massive crackdown on political and judicial actors, journalists, trade unionists, church groups, because church groups have been involved and red tagged also. I have friends, even a Dutch person, who had to move out of where he was because he found his photo on a poster, and he's been there for years. And I give that background to say, look at where Australia is in all of this. In terms of the anti-terrorism law, Australia helped write it, despite knowing the increasing human rights violations, the red tagging that's going on, the total disregard of any sort of rule of law. And the other scary thing was their anti-terrorism law was based on the security laws of Australia. And when we were trying to find out, the Solidarity Group wrote to the Foreign Affairs to ask if it was true that they helped write this anti-terrorism law. They claimed that it was one of the best laws complying with international standards, and that so is Australia's. But there was a forum recently, and if anyone heard it, we have very repressive security laws. And the UN Human Rights Commission and the reporters and the international, Amnesty International, all say this anti-terrorism law is draconian. The other thing is, despite knowing that the Philippine military have been involved in massive and increasing human rights abuse, Australia entered into an Enhanced Defence Cooperation Program in December 2019. And recently in the Philippines in October of 2020, Linda Reynolds from the Department of Defence stated that Australia had trained over 10,000 members of the Armed Forces of the Philippines between 2017 and 2020, as well as 100 each year trained in Australia. She outlined the activities under this agreement, which included land-based activities focused on urban combat and joint coordination skills, together with enhanced intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance in the south, and enhanced maritime training activity. This is as well as equipment and finance. And I have to say, just after their first training in urban combat, a semi-martial law was declared in Negros, and the soldiers went house to house in the early hours of the morning, in having learned how to do urban warfare, pulled out any leaders of progressive parties, for peasant groups, etc., and shot them in front of their families. So this is where our training helps. And then if we look at why it's involved, there's two obvious reasons, and I think Claude really Cesar brought out one of them. Anyway, first one is counter-terrorism. The government sees the prospect of Al-Qaeda or Jemaah Ismailiyah operating in Mindanao. And so the Mindanao, which is in the southern part of the Philippines, was seen by Washington and Australia as part of a global terrorist threat. So we had the bombing of Marawi, a Moro Muslim town in Mindanao. If you talk to the people there, they said it wasn't Al-Qaeda, it wasn't any terrorist group, and they could have handled it between them. They actually went to the military to say they will handle it, and it was turned down. And they started the attack on Marawi. And we, Australia, sent 2 Orion aircraft to provide surveillance and support for the Philippine Army. There are still over 1,000 people missing there, and they're known to be civilians. And they're not terrorists. And despite Australia saying they're giving to a task force, Bangong Marawi, which is supposedly, it's got military and police and officials involved, supposedly to restore Marawi. But the people there are still displaced, and they're wondering where the money has gone. And when they've gone to what they call ground zero, where their houses were, they were told it was too dangerous to return yet. But they saw Chinese businessmen being shown around the area. And this is their ancestral land because they're Indigenous people. So we have been helping in this bombing of an Indigenous peoples. The other, of course, is China. And that's what keeps Australia's military cooperation. The Philippines, in terms of a Quad or anything, is not considered capable. But the strategic position of the Philippines makes it important. In that same release mentioned before, Reynolds reiterated that the Philippines is an important security partner where we continue to work closely together in shared commitment to an open, inclusive, prosperous Indo-Pacific. You heard that before. During the discussions, Reynolds stated, we affirmed our shared interest in upholding maritime security, including the South China Sea, and our support for the right of all states to exercise freedom of navigation and overflight in accordance with the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. So the importance of the Philippines is its geostrategic location, not for any of its military strength. The rising strength of China looms large in the security calculus more than ever. Concerned about the vast economic benefits and security concerns that China's rise presents in the region, and the fact that Duterte has been playing off in the US and China, Australia has chosen to respond to the risk of increased regional instability by pursuing closer ties with many of its neighbours, which is through the Quad. So Australia is involved in building the Philippine military capacity for counter-terrorism and maritime security because of its location. Australia has a problem in that it's currently a member of the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, Council on Human Rights. It endorsed the reports condemning the human rights violations in the Philippines. The DFAT statement says Australia is committed to advancing human rights globally. Men and women and children have the fundamental right, freedoms to live their lives with dignity. Australia's commitment to human rights reflects our national values and is an underlying principle of Australia's engagement with the international community. That's their statement. And in fact, the DFAT have been pushing for criticising the Philippines on some, particularly on the drug issue, but it's not clearly the government approach to the Philippines. And while funding for military has increased, in fact, funding for diplomats in the Philippines has been reduced and staff pulled out. So we have this real politic that Cesar was talking about, and we don't have that attitude of diplomacy that Claude was mentioning. So we really have to raise our voices here against human rights abuses, against security, draconian security legislation, both here and in the Philippines. And we need to call for return to peace talks, because there were peace talks in the Philippines which Turkey stopped. So thanks a lot.
Well, thank you very much, Pat, for giving us such a clear and focused account of the situation in the Philippines and of Australia's responsibility. It's deeply challenging, and we're very grateful and we're very glad to have you with us. We are running a bit over time, so we've got two more brief contributions. The third one is from Dr. Helen Hill. And I don't want to curtail Helen in any way, because Helen is one of our stars. Helen has been working in areas of development and neocolonialism for many years, going right back to Student Christian Movement and World Student Christian Federation days. Her master's thesis was in independence in Portuguese Timor, and her doctorate in non-formal education in Fiji. She taught at Victoria University in Melbourne for 25 years, established a BA in Asia-Pacific Community Development, and one of her students, who became Vice Minister of Education in Timor-Leste, and invited Helen to go back there and to work on establishing tertiary education in Timor-Leste. And she's now working on the reform of secondary education. So it's very warm welcome to you, Helen. It's great to see you again, and thanks for making the time. And it's over to you. Thanks. Helen, you have to unmute. You unmute? Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Good. No, well, thank you very much for that great welcome, and I'm very pleased to be able to join you from Dili here. I'm in Timor, working for the Timorese government, and I am very impressed by the talks we've had so far. They have made me think of a number of things, and 2 points. I really want to make 2 points, main points about redefining or trying to expand the concept in people's minds of both non-violence and security, because these are terms that are thrown around quite a lot, and I think need more exploration by various groups. And what comes to mind with me at the moment is that non-violence must, there's a danger with non-violence being, the term non-violence has the problem associated with all terms that are defined by what they're not. Non-violence, like non-formal education, non-government organisations, you define them by what they're not. And so they lack a bit of an essence. But it is, I think, important for people in the peace movement to broaden people's concept of what is meant by non-violence, because otherwise people might think non-violence is sitting passively back and doing nothing. And during the Vietnam War, of course, we had big debates between people who advocated non-violence and wanted a military victory by the other side. So there was a bit more of a debate then. And some types of activities, I think, need to be identified and discussed as examples of non-violence. Now, one of the ones that I'm aware of, I'm not sure whether people in Australia are so aware of it, but Jason McLeod in West Papua has been engaging in some extraordinary actions. Oh, I mean, with the Papuans. I mean, it's the Papuans who've been engaging in the extraordinary actions of non-violent direct resistance. You know, there's non-violent direct resistance to military activities. And the West Papuans are trying to learn a bit from the Timorese about the struggle, but they are in a very different situation than the Timorese. They've built a diplomatic front, they've got sort of clandestine organisations, but they don't have an armed wing as such, but are, I think, trying to develop non-violent direct action as a philosophy and a methodology within the citizens of West Papua. Now, another type of non-violent action, which the Timorese government involved itself in, was when the Sustainable Development Goals were being written. And Timor was head of an organisation called the G7, the countries, the fragile countries, mostly post-conflict countries. When the Sustainable Development Goals were being negotiated, they went to the various open forums. And this is the thing about the SDGs are very important because of the way that they were negotiated. Unlike any other UN document, they really came from different grassroots organisations and professional organisations. Timorese government said we've got to have peace as one of the SDGs. Most countries did not want peace as one of the SDGs, but Claude made reference to SDG 16 today, and that is there because the Timorese and the other little G7 plus members would not leave until peace was put into the SDGs. And how do they define peace? Strong institutions, struggles against corruption, and activities like this can be defined as part of non-violent actions in favour of peace. And of course, the ICANN action at the UN, of course, you all know about that. I think we need to highlight a lot of different types of actions and sort of categorise them under the non-violent, you know, body of work that can be done. And I would like to suggest also bringing more economic activities into this. I'm involved in a group in Timor called the Social and Solidarity Economy Network. Now, this actually exists in many countries. I don't know whether it exists in Australia, but the concept that the solidarity economy is cooperatives, credit unions, fair trade, microfinance, parallel and alternative currencies, basic minimum income, and a lot of economic strategies that are developed from the ground up by citizens, not relying on government, but of course, hopefully linking in with government to have good legislation that facilitates these sort of things to happen. And I'm interested to see today that the Victorian government's launching a big housing policy. Now, the whole concept of cooperative housing is hardly known in Australia, but in many countries it becomes a key empowerment. And a lot of these activities, I believe, are a form of non-violent action. And this brings me now to the concept of redefining security, because it's quite frightening listening to what Sister Pat had to say about the situation in the Philippines. And I have advocated ever since the 1980s, when I lived in Fiji. The Pacific Islanders really wanted to redefine security after the New Zealanders stopped the nuclear warships going to New Zealand ports, and Pacific Islanders said, oh, this is great because this shows that we sleep more safely in our beds at night knowing there are not nuclear ships, not the other way around, as people think we sleep more safely in our bed at night knowing we've got a nuclear umbrella to shelter under if the enemy should come. And the idea that access to food, access to healthcare, access to housing is a more important part of security than having warships going around in the Pacific became quite a talking point then. Now, there is, of course, a trap in redefining security beyond, beyond the purely military definition. And I'm sorry to say the Australian government is deeply mired in some actions in Canberra with the prosecution of Witness K and Bernard Collaery. And they are trying to redefine security, and in the wrong way. We redefine security away from a threat to national security of the government, which is what they're arguing, to really protection of certain commercial interests who might be, and politicians' reputations who might be badly besmirched if the trial of Bernard Collaery and Witness K was to become public. Now, I haven't got time to talk about this. I hope people understand exactly who Bernard Collaery and Witness K are. This case arises out of the Australian government bugging of the negotiation room when Mari Alkatiri and John Howard were negotiating the terms of the well, it wasn't the maritime boundary then, because it wasn't going to be a maritime boundary, but it was the oil, access to the oil revenues in the Timor Sea. And when you turn something, again, when you turn something like the war on drugs into a military campaign, as happens in the Philippines, you really get into a frightful risk. So I think that the whole concept of redefining security so that it is about things that make people more secure. And again, the SDGs do give a lot of examples of sectors in which, for example, access to energy security, renewable energy is available. It takes work to set up the organisations through which it needs to be generated. And the solidarity economy approach to renewable energy is a good one and being followed in some countries. Unfortunately, food security is being adopted even by the UN, I'm sorry to say, in a way which, through bringing in large corporate sectors like Nestle would be one of the worst companies in the world in its ripping off of people from their water. You know, we know from the old story of the baby formula promotion, it's still doing that. There's a whole lot of ways in which certain corporate interests, under the name of food security, are now bringing in very inequitable relations and taking rights away from farmers. And the whole struggle for food sovereignty. In Timor, we have a big debate between the organisations, a lot of them funded by Australian aid, who talk about food security, but from an industrial agriculture point of view, and permaculture, who is arguing for food sovereignty. And in a sense, my argument is these type of activities and debates need to be brought a little bit more into the peace movement and be defined as non-violent, and actions involved in building food sovereignty, building citizens' rights, housing rights, need to be, linked with as pieces of non-violent action that can be carried out. Now, another thing I'll just mention about what the Australian government's doing is putting a lot of money into projects, not only the Australian government, into projects geared towards ending violence against women, but simply throwing money at some of these problems without addressing underlying inequalities of workplace relations between men and women, including in the home, including in the subsistence sector. You will never achieve anything. So that it is, incumbent, I think, upon the peace movement. And this is why I'm pleased to be part of Pax Christi, even though I'm fairly remote, don't have a lot of input into it, to be able to be able to contribute to this today. I think I better stop there. I think I might have reached my time.
So thank you very much indeed, Helen, for those very challenging words. You've really got to the heart of the matter of how our whole attitude towards security, defence, militarism has got to radically change. How we've got to look at how we actually make peace. And it goes back to what Claude says at the beginning. And forces that are working against us, which are not just military, they're political and economic as well. So anyway, our final speaker, we have a brief comment from Maggie Galley. And Maggie is the Secretary of Pax Christi Australia, a National Secretary. She's been an active participant in Pax Christi since prior to the Iraq War, and strongly opposed Australia participating in the so-called Coalition of the Willing, along with thousands of other Australians. And she's active in Pax Christi New South Wales. So I'll just hand over to you, Maggie, for a brief comment.
Thank you, and it has been very enlightening here and very, how could I say, distressing at times. However, I'm going to talk about a different part of the heart. The sentence that I'm going to draw on to talk about, I think emerged from the Just Peace conference that Claude attended in 2016. And the statement is, the goal of non-violent resistance to injustice is to awaken humanity in every person. So these are great words, but just how do we put such bold and courageous statement into action? And I think this statement is really at the heart of what we need to do to move along in creating a better world. Claude has highlighted the importance of creating justice for all, just peace. Caesar has provided insights into the difficulties within our region, its complexity, and the movement to militarisation. I, like you, thirst for justice for all, right and respectful relationships, but what can I do to assist in making justice a reality? The issues we face, cannot be solved by an individual or group or nation. We need to work together globally to solve the huge challenges that we face. And the ones we know that come to mind are climate change, nuclear weapons, violence and poverty. And that's just a few. We must learn to work together. I recall reading Patcham Terrace in the early days of participating in Pax Christi, and I was struck by the good sense of this document, talking about right relationships in all spheres of our life. Of course, written in an era where women were identified as men. I go there. I was recently introduced by Jill Burrows to a different version of a similar message in Pache and Terrace called the Difficult Conversation project, developed by Kern Burr, I think, an American psychologist. It came into being because of a concern for the divide that had sprung up in the US following the election of Donald Trump in 2016. Kern was so shocked and realised that he'd been living in a bubble. He went with his son on a road trip across the US to understand better the national psyche, and he ran workshops. He did make the point that he originally wanted to provide support to liberal-minded people, but the workshops attracted both liberal and conservatives. Kern uses science describing how our primal responses kick in when we feel threatened. Flight, flee, freeze. The dominant threats in my experience of my culture are not physical. They are ideas and values that do not necessarily match mine. So Kern's workshops recommended 3 principles and areas of attention. 1, prioritize the relationship against always being right. See beyond your own story. Transform resistance into response. Now, these principles are a helpful guide to me. Kern states that transformation happens from hate to love, from rejection to acceptance, from alienation to connection. This is the shift that has to happen. It only happens individual by individual by individual. This project has application here in Australia too, as conversations and positions become more and more polarised. Megan Phelps, I don't know if you're aware of her, like she is a former member of that very significant Westboro Church group that went around vilifying people. Sorry, I can give you more detail. I've actually linked I can send the links to all of these to give you connections to these talks, but she gives a wonderful TED talk on how she engaged with others who thought differently to her. So some of Megan's tips for change were, do not assume bad intent. This allows our minds to be more open to dialogue. Ask questions, helps to map the disconnect. It signals that we are listening. Stay calm. This takes practice and patience. Refuse to escalate the subject. Make the argument. The value of our position can seem so right and good to us. However, we are all the product of our upbringing, and our beliefs reflect our experiences. We cannot expect others to spontaneously change their minds. Megan says that she was approached as a human being. Her friends on Twitter, of all places, pointed out with gentleness and patience the inconsistencies between her beliefs and practice. That approach was far more transformative than 2 decades, full decades of outrage and disdain. So, and yesterday I came across an article in The Correspondent. It's a publication produced in Britain by Rutger Bregman, and he's the guy who went to the Davos World Economic Forum and said basically the rich should be paying taxes. So he writes, good behaviour is contagious. It can also influence structural change and vice versa. So look to the system, yes, but remember you are part of it, and look in the mirror for change too. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Maggie. You really have nailed it. I think that's all needs to be said. You've taken us right to the heart of the issue. Now, we're running seriously over time. Are people happy to continue till 4 o'clock or whatever the equivalent time is where you are? Is everybody? Right, we shall do that. And I'm going to just throw it open. We were going to go into breakout groups, but I think we haven't really got time for that. So I'll throw it open to you, and I would suggest we pick up some of the points that Maggie raised, which seem to gather together what a lot of the other speakers were saying. Was, where do we begin? How do we affect the sort of cultural change about redefining what we mean by security and defense and fear and all of those things? And how do we break out of the bubble? Rita listed a long list of organizations working on peace. Most of them were focused, I think, on specific issues, and most of them seem to be into reacting to specific things that were going on. But I wondered if they're really just the same people talking to each other all the time. So how are we going to get beyond that and talk and communicate with people who share our views, who belong to our organizations, and who might have convictions of a different kind? So let's just throw it open. If you want to put something on chat, do so. Otherwise, wave your hand. I'll try and here's Brian Johnson. I'll try and pick you up as I go. I've got 3 screens here. Oh, 2 screens actually. I wonder, I see Loretta Castro there. You're from the Philippines, Loretta. I wonder, would you like to throw something in? You'll have to unmute yourself if you don't mind. Are you able to do that? Would you like to say a few words or not? Loretta, do you hear me?
I just unmuted myself. Yeah, I am from the Philippines. My name is Loretta, and I am from Pax Christi, Philippines. And I want to express my appreciation for this forum. I don't really have a question. I just find that all the inputs are very helpful to us. Of course, Sister Patricia, we thank you for your great concern for our country. We know what happened to you. And in our own way, we're trying to do what we can. And in the Philippines, I know that I can't remember the name of the person who talked about nonviolence. In the Philippines, what the term that we use is active nonviolence. To give the message to our fellow Filipinos that it does not mean being passive, but trying to do what we can given our circumstances to resist what, because as you know, we are not in a very good place in my country. And within the limits, we try to do what we can. So we tell everyone in our circles that we have to resist, and we have to do. We have to seek peace by ways of peace, because as you know, we also have armed struggle here, and there are people supporting the New People's Army, and the attacks and counterattacks. So that's all I can say for now. Thank you very much to Pax Christi Australia for this forum. Thank you.
Thank you, Loretta. Great to see you this afternoon. Right, who else would like to? There are a number of people from outside Australia, if any of them would like to join in, but otherwise it's wide open, but you will have to unmute yourself if you want to say anything.
Can you hear me, Harry?
Yes.
Yeah. I think the point Maggie made about how we communicate is important. But also the language you use has to be explained in a way. You speak of security, immediately the connotations are military. People think it's military security and governments, etc., are falling over each other to secure the country, and they go into militarization, armaments, and so on. But if we were to unpack what security means really, and if we were to unpack security really as we mean it, is to allow a greater humanity to emerge. And in that definition, then we talk about where it can happen. That can happen in the environment. It can happen in the equality as opposed to inequality. It can happen in the food sector. It can happen in the education sector and so on. And the reason why we have to link security to militarization, etc., is that many valuable resources are taken away from that kind of outcome to be able to beef up military hardware and so on. So we make the connection that if security means for humanity to emerge, and we can, I mean, I just talked very briefly, we can have a whole conference on that. And if we show how military outlays is an impediment to that, and if we were to define this in terms that are acceptable to most normal people, there might be the start of a debate or start of a conversation, I believe. But we need to do something along those lines, or else we are still talking from our trenches. We are really stuck in our trenches. We have to get out of them. You talk to the government, they give you the same message as before, so we can't go. But we have to unpack the language, and hopefully that will lead to a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Caesar. Anyone else like to contribute or like to throw something in or ask a question?
Harry, I'll just put a small bit in. I think we need to reinterpret what we mean by speaking truth to power, because that's accusatory. And what Maggie brought up to us, that we should not be assuming bad intent on the part of others. So we should be seeking to use language that enables them to explain what their aims and how they're going about it. Presumably that's not straightforward and easy to do, but it may help just not to come in to things with an accusatory state of mind.
Yes, we need to break out of tribalism. I think we're all part of when we get sucked into it so terribly easy, and it's almost a sort of spiritual redefinition of ourselves, I think.
I liked what Maggie said, that little quote about awakening humanity in every person, which picks up the approach that you're talking about, Barbara. But I also, there's so much here, it's hard to know where to start. But I also like the thought that I might question people in government every time they use that word security. And then people accept the word security very blithely, accepting that the government is keeping us secure in so many different ways, from terrorists in our community, from Sudanese groups, but also secure from other countries that might be going to invade us. But I probably think that we need to raise that discussion. I like that point that Helen made about looking at the language again that we use for security, and the other one was the real meaning of non-violence and what exactly do we do that's active about non-violence. And I think Loretta picked that up as well, I think, just now.
Thank you. Katrina.
There's a lot to talk about, Harry.
There is a lot to talk about. We can't possibly talk about it now, but we should at least, can lay down markers for how we can carry on from here. I'm wondering if our comment as what their impression is of what's been happening in this look into the Asia-Pacific region. Would you like to say anything, Aaron? Or?
Can you hear me?
Yes, clearly.
One moment.
Any noises? Could everybody who isn't muted mute themselves? That might be
Can you hear me still?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I had two computers open because the sound isn't working on one and the video isn't working on the other. Yeah, so thank you so much for these contributions. It was really interesting for me to hear a lot from this region, of course, because I don't come from this region, but also because I don't come from the Catholic tradition. I'm Protestant. So it was really wonderful to hear both the regional context and some of the theological reflections, as I'm still quite new to the Pax Christi International movement. I was really interested, especially in Caesar's contributions, to learn more about how intra-country and inter-regional cooperation works in military activities and how that plays out as part of the foreign policy of countries in the area. Of course, I was also inspired, I can't remember, I'm sorry, which one of the respondents was talking about alternative ways to participate in the economy, talking about alternative currencies and these kind of things. And I felt it was really inspiring to hear more about how, if you piece together all of these different strategies, how it can be really quite compelling, a way to kind of counteract some of these forces that seem very overwhelming. The other thing that really struck me, and again, I'm sorry, I can't remember who said it, was that war is the biggest, was it biggest polluter or biggest factor in climate change? And I thought that was really striking. It kind of surprised me a bit. And I would like to hear more about that, because in my mind, I would always think, oh, it's capitalism or it's consumption or it's resource extraction, but I had never heard it framed that way. So I would like to hear more about why that is the case. So that would be really interesting for me. But I thank you very much for this presentation and for inviting me.
Well, thank you very much for getting up in the morning, so early in the morning and coming. And we hope you'll be able to come and visit us in the region very soon. So thank you again. And don't forget, of course, that North and South America are part of the Pacific. Somebody else. Yes, Bernardine.
I'd like to say, yes, I think we need a whole workshop on Maggie's ideas of how we, have peace. Yes, we need to pull it out and perhaps even use Sister Pat's ideas of, we could work on the Philippines or something. Yeah.
Lionel, had you got your hand up? Mute. Yeah.
Thank you so much. It has been a very fruitful conversation. I just wanted to point out one or two things. In the matter of national security or international security, we seem to use this term and bandy it about purely in military or weapons terms. And we talk about security against terrorism and whatnot. But if you go deep into the concept of security, the more you weaponize and militarize yourself, the more insecure you are. It's a paradox that many national governments think of security in terms of militarization and weaponization and pacts like Quad, what Caesar was talking about. But they are tremendously insecure. And security is more a function of building human resources within your nation and among nations. And beginning with the fundamental security of livelihoods. You know, like for instance, I am now based in Toronto, but I am originally from India, like Caesar, who's a good friend of mine. There's a lot of insecurity in India. It's supposed to be a rising power and all that, which perhaps it is in some ways. But there's no security of drinking water. There's no security of employment, of environment. So these are fundamental insecurities. So unless you build up the human resource base from the bottom of the pyramid upwards, rather than the other way around, which is often the case, where elites call the shots, and you know the trickle-down effect of development, which is a big myth. It never trickles down. It evaporates somewhere. But so let me be brief. My contention is that security is built on the basis of basic human rights and human needs being fulfilled from the most basic, like education, health, sanitation, and all, and employment, a good environment. That is what builds the security of a people, not the weaponization, which is a diversion of resources from the most fundamental needs to this luxury of, competing with others in the armaments race. So that's the challenge before us when we're talking about national or international security. How do we build up the base of human resources and go up from there? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I've got Jonathan Frerichs, and I've also got Andre Furtado who indicated they'd like to speak. So Jonathan, would you like to go first?
Yes, and thank you. It's great to be with you from afar. I grew up in Papua New Guinea and went to high school in Australia, in Brisbane. So I feel connected to you somehow. The first part of the talks really helped me to understand the shift I've seen. I sit here in Geneva, and I play a little role in Pax Christi and trying to do liaison with delegations here on issues like nuclear weapons and killer robots to some extent, mostly around disarmament. And I'm still stunned every time the Australian diplomats open their mouths at the meetings, because it's not the Australia that I grew up near or in and came to appreciate it. Your country just looks like a little America with the same outlook to foreign affairs. And it's very depressing to see things going that way. And it's very contrary, I think, to the kind of peace we're talking about. I wanted to say specifically something that came to mind. I thought there's a beautiful balance between what we heard from East Timor and then what we heard from Maggie, both our own personal comportment, but then the very practical application of the concerns that we have into what I would call change goals. And so I think this falls into place for Pax Christi as a bigger international association. If people like you make it your plan, as you must have done many, many times in your life, to join up with specific things which are on the agenda. So for example, in the area of the nuclear weapons treaty, lots of your little island states read the list on the ICANN website of who has ratified the treaty and who has signed it. And it's a little island treaty. The small countries of the world are taking the lead and telling everybody else that the nuclear era has got to be over. There's just no time for it in the face of climate change and pandemics and all the other things we have to solve. It's so yesterday, so 20th century retrograde issue. And who's saying that? The small, the weak. As Christians, I think we know that that's where truth is going to come from. So your steps to keep your government reminded of its malfeasance with things like the nuclear treaty, I think really add together like grains of sand, drops of water for actions being taken by Pax Christi members all over the world. Somebody mentioned economic boycotting, economic measures. That's fantastic also with nuclear weapons to do something in aid of the divestment effort for Australian banks, Australian corporations, Australian arms makers. And then with killer robots, could I say that the religious voice is remarkably silent at the level of the international campaign, the killer robots campaign. You know what we're talking about. We're talking about outsourcing murder to an algorithm. The sixth commandment, automated, algorithmed. And the big countries, and Australia included, it's joining the big countries in this one again, are not speaking anything that we can appreciate about this kind of issue. So religious leaders' voices and religious people's voices really needs to be heard on an issue like this. So there's a variety, I think, of practical measures which are in front of us, which many of you know throughout your lives. And I just really encourage you for gathering like this. You look extremely devoted from where I sit because you're gathering in the middle of the night and talking about these things that matter so much to us all and making Pax Christi really a force for what it is, Pax and Christ. So thank you. It's been a great pleasure to be with you at this meeting.
Thank you very much. And finally, Andre Furtado, would you like to comment briefly? And this will be the last one, I'm afraid. Andre?
Yes. Can you hear me all?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm very new to Pax Christi. I'm only here because of Cesar de Mello. I mean, he's so enthusiastic about it, and he told us he was going to be on today. So I said, all right, let's find out what this is all about. And I was very impressed because everybody took a different piece of the pie. And so, you know, you didn't just see the trunk of the elephant or the ears. I mean, you got the entire thing, and I was very, very pleased to get that feeling. However, I have some questions, so I don't have much to comment, but they're questions, and anybody can answer this. I mean, you have a Pax Christi in Australia, in the US, whatever, but you know, the big divider is religion. So my question is, have you guys tried to go beyond the Christi part and say, make a deal with a Sino-Pax or a Pax Islam or a Pax Buddha or a Pax Hindu, whatever, find these groups in the various places where they are and connect with them to go beyond religion? I think we would have a lot more power, because this is a global issue. This is not just a Christian issue. This is a global issue. And maybe you're already doing it, and I have no knowledge about this, but this is the question that I would ask and say, if you really want this to be a global issue, you have to connect with other religions where they're doing the same kind of thing, where they want peace. And I just wanted to put that out and see if anybody, you know, had some answers for me. Or so I'm ignorant of Pax Christi. So please, you know, this is just a question out in the dark. I'm not trying to pontificate here or anything. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Andre, for putting those questions. The short answer is yes. Certainly Pax Christi in Australia, Pax Christi elsewhere, is it's a long journey, I'd have to say, and it sort of illustrates how we all come from different assumptions and different issues, but for many of us have been working with other faiths, and will continue to do so, and you're absolutely right for the necessity. Just to sum up, I'm not going to sum up, but to COVID is devastating humanity around the world, not least in some of the wealthiest countries. And it raises all sorts of other questions that didn't come out of nowhere, and it's closely related to to the issues we're talking about. But there have been some unexpected blessings. And one is the discovery of Zoom, which drives some of us mad at times, but which enables us to have wonderful international, worldwide interactions like this afternoon, which have enriched what our speakers have raised. I think between them, they've really nailed what the issues are, and the issues relate is not what other people should be doing, but who we are. Where do we begin? How do we break out of the bubble? How do we start talking to the people we don't normally talk with? How do we get out of the tribes that we continually create? And that, I think, is one of the challenges. And I think one of the things Pax Christi should be doing is to try and see the situation. Oh, what is peace? What is security? Not get too bogged down in single issues, important though they may be. So I'd like to thank our speakers very much. Thank you, and thank you all for coming and for enriching this very valuable discussion, and particularly thanking Caesar, who's obviously gone to a lot of trouble to help set this up. I suspect that, I hope that this sort of conversation will become